And to me, this seems almost like a pharmaceutical ad or some sort of advocacy ad. You almost expect like there'll be a phone number at the end, like to find out if gender affirming care is right for you, call this number. It's not often that I come to the defense of the CBC, but in this particular case, I think it is warranted. Credit where credit is due, as they say. I'm referring specifically to a leaked memo that came out a number of weeks ago following the October 7th Hamas attacks, wherein the CBC was purported to have banned the use of the word terrorist and terrorism in their news reporting. Now, that's not exactly what the memo said, and we'll get to that in a moment, but many people have attacked the CBC for its reluctance or its unwillingness to use terms like terrorist and terrorism when referring to Hamas and its October 7th attacks. Now, even though I think the CBC is more or less right in this case, or as others have said, and I tend to agree, that they have a defensible position. Before I get into that, for whatever it's worth, me personally, I most certainly do think that Hamas is a terrorist organization, and most certainly the atrocities committed on October 7th are most certainly terrorist acts, in my opinion. However, the point of this memo that was leaked was that the CBC itself ought not to use these terms because, as we'll see in a moment, these are loaded terms. And I want to share a little bit of a blog post by Brody Fenlon, who is, I guess, the CBC's editor-in-chief, I think, or news editor. Can't remember his news editor's blog. And he talks about, I'll put a link to this in the description. I just want to read a little excerpt of this. So this is a blog post in response to the leaked memo. Attribution of the word, this is Brody writing, attribution of the word terrorist has been our policy for decades, mirrored by other news organizations such as the BBC, AP, AFP, and Reuters, among many others. Our focus is to report the facts of such atrocities with accuracy, clarity, and detail to convey the scale and scope of violent acts wherever they occur, to quote the people affected, and to convey the views of the officials and experts on these events. We bear witness, but CBC News does not itself designate specific groups as terrorists or specific acts as terrorism, regardless of the region or the events, because these words are so loaded with meaning, politics, and emotion that they can end up being impediments to our journalism. And like I said, credit where credit is due. Now, my concern here is that although I tend to agree with this position, or I think it's a laudable position, as I interpret that, he's saying that there are certain words that have a certain slant to them or that depict a certain side or a point of view, and as a news broadcaster, they ought to stay somewhat removed or neutral as possible anyway when reporting the events. That is, if the people in the news, that is the actual news makers, politicians, experts, what have you, people on the ground, if they want to use the word terrorist or terrorism, the CBC will report that, but the CBC as an organization will not be using those terms. I like this policy, frankly. I think or I like the spirit of it. My concern is that the CBC does not follow this in other areas. And I'll share a few examples in a moment. And I think part of the problem, well, I'll share these examples, but just to give a bit of a heads up here, or head start, is I think the problem is the CBC is trying to do journalism and activism at the same time, and the result is they're doing neither particularly well. I think activism certainly has a role in our society. There's certain positions or certain outcomes that we might be interested in a society, or there's certain things that we have opinions on. I certainly have opinions, and I think it makes sense for people to advocate for a specific course of action in terms of public policy, laws, that kind of thing. However, I don't believe it's the role for a news organization, and certainly not a crown corporation or a public broadcaster like the CBC, to be advocating or to be overtly advocating for a specific course of action. Now, there's a number of areas where the CBC does clearly advocate for different positions. And there's just one that I want, or one category, I'll share a few examples of it, where the CBC does that. And that is specifically when it comes to what is referred to as gender-affirming care. Now, just that term, I might argue that it is a term like terrorism. To use Brodie Fenland's own words, the term gender-affirming care is loaded with meaning, politics, and emotion. And I think even the use of that term can be an impediment to the CBC's journalism. I mean, just the word affirming sounds positive, that we are validating one's gender. Now, maybe you think that is the case. Maybe you think that someone who was born male and wants to transition to female, and whatever medical treatment they take to achieve that's affirming their gender. There are people who think that, and you can think that if you'd like, of course. But there are many others. It's by no means an across-the-board view. There are many people that think doing that is actually gender denying, or it's genital mutilation. Now, genital mutilation is also a charged term. It's certainly not neutral. Actually, we'll get to what might be a relatively neutral term that, oddly enough, comes from a political party. But anyway, I just want to share a few clips from the CBC where they talk about gender-affirming care. And you ask me if this is avoiding loaded language.
To U.S. politics next. Republican-controlled states are bringing in new measures targeting the LGBTQ community.
So just off the top there, it's interesting, just as a quick side note, even though this doesn't exactly have to do with my point here, it's interesting that the Liberal Party of Canada and the CBC often accuses Pierre Poilievre of bringing American-style politics to Canada, yet when it suits their narrative, it seems that the CBC is very happy to talk about U.S. politics. And what's interesting here, well, there's a few things here. She talks about, this is talking about legislation in Florida and in Texas. So we won't get into the details of it, but these are pieces of legislation that have been passed that are meant to curtail sex change treatments, interventions, specifically to minors, I believe. But it's interesting that this newscaster describes it as targeting the LGBT community, or LGBTQ. I'm not sure. There's lots of different letters here. And that's interesting. I'll just replay that quickly.
Controlled states are bringing in new measures targeting the LGBTQ community.
The LGBTQ community. So, I mean, these laws, are they really targeting lesbians and gays and bisexuals? Now, arguably it's targeting some trans people, I suppose. Although, is it really targeting a community? Like, there's many trans people or people who say they're trans who don't take medical interventions. They maybe just dress differently or behave differently, and that's how they are trans in their own mind. So this is a very specific thing, but she says it's attacking the whole community. And also, just in their little headline here, they're calling it anti-LGBTQ legislation. To me, that's taking a specific stance on things. Now, here's another clip, and
Conservative delegates voted Saturday to add new social...
And just to sort of set this up, this is David Cochrane, I believe, and he's talking about the convention that the Conservative Party had a number of months ago. This is from 2 months ago. And at that convention, party members, I guess, passed a number of resolutions. And pay attention to the language that he uses, especially compared to the language that the Conservative Party of Canada actually uses. And oddly, I'd say that the language that the Conservative Party uses is actually much more neutral than what the CBC newscaster himself is using. See if you catch it.
Conservative policies to their party playbook. Two of those policies concern gender and trans issues. Nearly 70% of party delegates voted for a motion that states minors should be prohibited from gender-affirming care, or as the motion puts it, life-altering medicinal or surgical interventions. And even
See what he did there? So, as I understand this, and the title that they have up there, what they actually voted on was, I guess the wording here is in quotations, were preventing, I guess, I'm not sure what the actual verb is, but curtailing, quote, life-altering medicinal or surgical interventions. But that's not what the CBC newscaster calls it. He calls it gender-affirming care.
nearly 70% of party delegates voted for a motion that states minors should be prohibited from gender-affirming care, or as the motion puts it, life-altering medicinal or surgical interventions. And even
so I find that interesting that, to me, calling it gender-affirming care is similar to the term terrorism in that it is loaded. It's not a neutral way. Some people think this care is gender-affirming, but not everyone thinks that. So why is the CBC so clearly using language that puts them on one side of this issue? But it's not just sort of these hard news stories. So they've run a number of other stories that are very sympathetic to, I guess, the trans experience, if you would call it that. So this is, again, these are all meant to be news stories. So this is CBC News, The National, which I guess is their flagship newscast. And just look how this piece is produced and pay attention to like the sound, the music. And I didn't put any music over this. This is the original sound. It's got this very emotional and welling, I think it's sort of a piano or sort of dramatic music in the background.
Yeah, it wasn't very easy. I was kind of like an outcast.
Being a transgender kid or teen living anywhere in Canada comes with challenges. But for people in rural areas or small towns like this, it can be especially tough, encountering attitudes that challenge their very existence.
We're allowing them to be chemically castrated and sterilized.
So you've got that sort of soft piano music. It's kind of somber, the rainy scene. It's building a certain mood.
Rural areas or
and this is, I won't show the whole thing, but it's another thing I found interesting was this person in here who I guess is a woman who is in the process of becoming a man, according to them. And listen to what she has to say about her doctor.
north of Ponoka. But the call with the doctor didn't go well.
He was like asking me really weird questions, like what if I wanted to get pregnant someday? What if I had a husband someday? I think he asked me like, what if you want to keep your boobs? Like, it was so weird and invasive. We just wanted a referral to a gender clinic. Just a referral was all that we wanted, and then it would be out of his hands. He refused to do that for us.
Trans youth.
Did you catch that? All he wanted, I guess his local doctor, he or she, it's confusing, even just the language around this. He wanted his doctor just to sign off, not to ask questions or to, help this person make a life-altering decision or think about it anyway. Just wanted to do a form so that this person can get life-altering medication. Again, look at, I won't dwell too much on this, but again, the music and just the way this is composed, it seems like an advocacy ad.
Gender-affirming healthcare can be life-saving, but depending on where you live in Canada, it's hard to get, and the wait can be years long. But there are healthcare providers across the country providing this kind of care. They want to make it easier for kids and teens to get it.
So affirming care is sort of a bigger term, but
so yeah, it's meant to be news. Now this next one, actually I'll skip this one. There's this one here, and this to me, this is out of Nova Scotia. Again, it's CBC News from a month ago. And to me, this seems almost like a pharmaceutical ad or some sort of advocacy ad. You almost expect like there'll be a phone number at the end, like to find out if gender-affirming care is right for you, call this number. Just listen to, again, music in the background and how this newscaster, Andrew Lamb, is, to me, clearly conveying a very strong position about what he thinks about so-called gender-affirming care. Have a listen.
people who come to know who they are before adulthood. That means some children and youth seek what's called gender-affirming care, types of care which can help a person explore their gender identity and be their authentic selves.
Be their authentic
It can be
self.
difficult for youth and their families to know how to access gender-affirming care. One option in Nova Scotia is for gender-diverse people under 18 and their caregivers to self-refer to one of the child and youth mental health.
So he's talking about how this is allowing someone to be their true self. Now, some people might think that's true. That's fine, but that's an opinion. That's not news. Then these graphics, it seems pretty cool, pretty much like almost like a government, like the type of thing you might see on TV to, like, you know, order your fire safety kit or to find out more about such and such thing. Let's see what else is here. But again, the music.
To wait a few years to access hormone therapy. And hormone and puberty blocking treatments aren't new and have been used in other situations. For example, the blockers are commonly used with very young children who develop puberty too early. Meanwhile, for gender-affirming surgery, the province's policy states that an individual must be 18 years or older at the time of the procedure, among other requirements. There are limited types of surgeries available for teenagers 16 years or older, but this requires an exemption application. Gender-affirming care also doesn't have to be medical. I spoke with IWK child and adolescent psychiatrist Sue Zink, who says care can begin with helping a youth and their family have their needs and improve mental health, which can then have positive knock-on effects like improved self-esteem. I asked the Canadian Pediatric Society about their perspective on all this.
Anyway, it goes on. I'll put a link in the description, but clearly like an advocacy ad, in my opinion. And again, getting back to Brody Fenlon's words, he's concerned about the words terrorist and terrorism because it is, what did he say? Because they're loaded with meaning, politics, and emotion. I mean, these pieces on gender-affirming care are clearly loaded. I think a way to think about journalism versus advocacy, and this is something that it's not just the CBC, but all our news media seem to have missed. By analogy, one can think of, I guess, advocacy as trying to figure out a path that we should take as a society to get to a given destination. Also, I guess, even arguing about what destination we should be heading toward, but also the path we should take to get there. And again, by that same analogy, you might think of journalism, traditional journalism or good journalism or dispassionate journalism as being akin to being like a map maker, cartographer, someone who makes a map of the territory so that others can use that map to navigate how to traverse that terrain. Now, a map by its very nature has to be a low resolution of what it represents. You can't have all the details of the world depicted on a map. A map strips away and curates information to make it easily digestible. Similarly, good journalism should do the same thing. It should take what's happening in the world, distill it, curate it, and present it in a more simplified, digestible means, but they should not distort the map itself. As soon as you start trying to put in your advocacy into your map making, then you get a map that isn't at all useful. So you don't really get journalism, you don't get a good, true depiction of what's going on in the world when it's so clear that there is an agenda behind it. Now, there's some people, and this is pretty common among postmodern types, where, and there's some truth to it, like a lot of these things, there's a kernel of truth, yet a lot of other stuff gets added on. So there is this idea that none of us, no matter how much we try, can ever be completely unbiased, that we bring our own frame of reference, our own experience, like our age, our gender, our social class. These things all are, where we've worked in the past. These things all affect how we perceive the world, and that is true. However, what sort of postmodernists, sort of the step they go beyond is they say, well, they say effectively, none of us can be completely unbiased, so we should figure out what bias we want and then just go wholeheartedly toward that bias. I reject that. If you look at science and good scholarship and other things, what one is trying to do is remove one's own bias as much as possible to sort of disentangle someone from the phenomenon that they're observing. That's sort of what science does. I run an experiment, and then you run the same experiment, and if we both do a good job keeping ourselves out of the experiment to make sure that we're not accidentally influencing it, and if enough people run that same experiment and notice the same pattern, we can conclude reasonably well that the pattern that we're observing is not due to our bias, but because of an actual pattern in the world. It helps us get to truth. You can think of it as sort of comparing notes with people. Like, you see something in the world, and like, do you see what I see? Are you noticing that? And if many people see the same kind of pattern, you get a sense of what the underlying thing is. So we're not necessarily completely getting rid of our bias, but we're taking steps to minimize it and to adjust or compensate for it by having other people do the same observation. So for example, I happen to live in Guelph, Ontario. I notice something in the world. Now maybe there's something about living in Guelph that makes me think that water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. Maybe there's some Guelph bias about the temperature. But you run that experiment in Athens and in London and in Calgary, and if they get the same results, you can be reasonably sure that that's not a unique thing to Guelph or Athens, but it's a real fact. Anyway, it is troubling. I mean, on the one hand, like, good for Brodie Fenelon. I think he's onto something here about trying to be more neutral or trying to be more removed. But they need to follow their own policy, especially when it comes to, things like the whole transgender issue. Not everyone believes that these medical interventions are gender affirming. Some people think that they are doing harm. I mean, I happen to believe that they're mostly doing harm. Is that to say it does harm in every last case? I'm less sure about that. But to say it so simply that, someone feels a certain way and we just start performing surgery and giving them drugs and stuff, that seems pretty crazy to me. And to just assume that that is a fact in the world and not an opinion or a viewpoint is to not do journalism, but to do advocacy. Anyway, tell me what you think. Is the CBC on the right track here with at least their notes on terrorism? Is there any hope for mainstream media at all? There's part of me that thinks it's too far gone and we need to come up with something new because it doesn't seem to be working. Or maybe we could do something to get our mainstream journalists back on track. For whatever it's worth, I don't think that just giving them more government money is going to fix it. I think it's going to make the matter much worse. But I'm curious to hear what you think. Leave your comments below. Let me know what you think about mainstream media and whether it is recoverable. Thanks for watching.